What happens to the world when 5 rising powers create a currency backed by something the dollar abandoned decades ago? Solid gold? Welcome to FINSFAR, where money isn't just saved, spent, or invested, it's understood. From financial history to modern market truths, we turn real stories into lessons that protect your future. That's the question, shaking governments, central banks, and financial markets right now because BRICS has just revealed its long-rumored gold-backed currency. And this move isn't symbolic, experimental, or theoretical. It's a direct challenge to the dollar's global dominance. For years, people laughed at the idea. They said BRICS was too divided, too unstable, too politically different to ever agree on a shared currency. But behind closed doors, these nations were quietly aligning their financial interests, growing their gold reserves, building alternative payment systems, and preparing a weapon the U.S. never expected. A currency whose value is tied to real, physical gold instead of debt, inflation, or political decisions. And when BRICS unveiled it, the message was unmistakable. We recreating a monetary system the West can manipulate. This isn't just about economics, it's about trust. The dollar is powerful because the world believes in American stability. But that belief has been cracking as U.S. debt explodes, inflation persists, and geopolitical tensions rise. A gold-backed BRICS currency offers something the modern world hasn't seen in decades, a store of value immune to printing presses, political cycles, and financial sanctions. For young people watching global chaos unfold, here's the truth. This moment mirrors the fall of the British pound, the collapse of the gold standard in 1971, and every major currency shift in the last 200 years. These transitions don't just reshape markets, they reshape the world you'll live in. And now the biggest question emerges: why did BRICS choose gold as its foundation at this exact moment in history? And what vulnerability in the dollar system made them believe the time to strike was now? Why would BRICS choose gold in a world dominated by digital money, credit systems, and trillion-dollar printing machines? The answer exposes a weakness the U.S. hoped no one would notice. Gold doesn't need trust. Gold doesn't depend on political stability. Gold doesn't care about elections, sanctions, debt ceilings, or interest rates. And over the last decade, BRICS nations quietly watched something alarming. The U.S. dollar, once the world's safest asset, was becoming increasingly fragile. America was printing trillions to manage crises. Debt was exploding faster than economic growth. Interest payments were reaching historic highs. And inflation was eroding the very confidence that made the dollar powerful. At the same time, Western sanctions froze the assets of entire nations, shocking countries that thought their reserves were safe. Russia lost access to hundreds of billions overnight. China's tech giants were targeted. Gulf nations received political pressure over oil. And one by one, countries realized something terrifying. If the dollar can be used as a weapon, then no nation's wealth is truly safe inside the Western system. That's when BRICS made its quiet decision: return to the one asset the U.S. cannot print, control, or freeze: gold. BRICS members began massively increasing their gold reserves. China built secret stockpiles. Russia doubled its holdings. India quietly bought record amounts. Brazil and Saudi Arabia diversified away from the dollar. When the gold-backed currency was announced, it wasn't impulsive. It was the final step in a decade-long strategy. And for young viewers, this is the key lesson. Financial power belongs to the side that controls real value, not printed promises. The BRICS currency is gold because gold sends a message the world understands instantly. This money is real. Now the next question becomes unavoidable. How exactly is this new gold-backed currency structured? And what makes it more dangerous to the dollar than anything the world has seen in 80 years? What makes the new BRICS gold-backed currency so dangerous that analysts in Washington are calling it the first real rival to the dollar since 1944? The answer lies in its design, because BRICS didn't simply copy the dollar or the euro. They built something engineered specifically for a multipolar world, something resistant to sanctions, inflation, and political manipulation. At its core, the currency is anchored to a basket of gold reserves pooled across member nations, meaning its value is tied to hard assets instead of national promises or government stability. This instantly makes it more attractive for countries burned by dollar volatility or U.S. political pressure. But the real genius is in the settlement system. BRICS developed a blockchain-based clearing mechanism that bypasses SWIFT entirely, allowing countries to trade oil, gas, minerals, and manufactured goods without touching the Western financial network. Transactions settle faster, cost less, and most importantly, cannot be intercepted or frozen by outside powers. This is where the threat becomes real for the U.S., because the dollar's dominance depends on being the default currency for global trade. If nations suddenly have a gold-backed alternative with better infrastructure, they no longer need to stockpile dollars, buy U.S. debt, or depend on American banks. And when enough countries reduce their dollar reserves, the U.S. loses its ability to borrow cheaply, weakening the very foundation of its economic power. For young viewers, here's the bigger picture. The BRICS currency isn't just money, it's architecture. It was a financial system designed to lock nations into a new trade ecosystem where the dollar is in key king. And once countries adopt it, switching back becomes nearly impossible. Which brings us to the next critical point. Why are so many nations lining up to join this new system? And which country's participation turns this from a challenge into a global threat to the dollar? Why are so many countries rushing toward the BRICS gold-backed currency as if it is a lifeboat in a sinking financial ship? Because nations across Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and Latin America see something the West refuses to admit. The global financial system built around the dollar is becoming increasingly unstable, politicized, and unpredictable. For decades, smaller economies were forced to operate within a system that benefited the U.S. while limiting their own monetary freedom. But now, BRICS is offering them an escape, a currency backed by real value, free from political pressure and tied to an economic bloc that represents nearly half the world's population. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Iran, Ethiopia, and Argentina didn't hesitate to join the expanded BRICS group. Indonesia, Nigeria, Pakistan, Mexico, and Turkey are openly signaling interest. Even nations traditionally aligned with the West are diversifying their reserves because they fear the same thing, being financially trapped in a system where the U.S. can freeze assets, raise interest rates unilaterally, or weaponize the dollar against anyone who steps out of line. For these countries, joining BRICS isn't rebellion, it's survival. A gold-backed currency gives them stability in a world of inflation, protection from sanctions, and leverage in negotiations with larger powers. And here, as the hidden truth for young viewers, once enough countries adopt the BRICS currency for trade, especially energy, a new global norm forms. The dollar loses exclusivity. Trade becomes multipolar. The balance of power shifts away from Washington toward a new coalition of rising economies. But the turning point isn't just how many nations join, it's who joins next. Because one specific country's interest in the gold-backed system has the potential to flip the entire global financial order. So the question becomes, which nation's participation would officially mark the beginning of a post-dollar era? And why is the U.S. more afraid of this one move than anything BRICS has done so far? What single country could join the BRICS gold-backed currency and instantly turn this from a challenge into a full-blown crisis for the U.S. dollar? The answer is Saudi Arabia, the nation that has quietly become the gravitational center of this entire financial shift. Because if BRICS controls gold, China controls manufacturing, Russia controls energy, and India controls population, Saudi Arabia controls the one thing that made the dollar the world's king: oil. For 50 years, every nation had to buy dollars, first just to buy energy. That system, the petrodollar, created endless global demand for the U.S. currency. It funded America's debt. It expanded its military. It shaped its influence. But the moment Saudi Arabia signals its willingness to join or even support the BRICS gold-backed settlement system, the petrodollar stops being a rule and becomes an option. And once it becomes optional, it begins to fade. Riyadh is already buying gold at record levels, building deeper ties with China, collaborating with BRICS members on digital payment systems, and openly exploring non-dollar trade. If Saudi Arabia anchors its oil exports to a gold-backed BRICS currency, dozens of nations will immediately follow. Because energy is the foundation of global trade, and energy priced in a new currency creates an entirely new financial world. For young viewers, here's the deeper reality. When a country that controls 15% of global oil supply shifts its monetary loyalty, the entire global system must shift with it. The U.S. knows this, Wall Street knows this, central banks know this, and that's why there is growing panic behind the scenes. Because this single move, Saudi Arabia embracing a gold-backed BRICS currency, is the event that could officially mark the end of 80 years of uncontested dollar dominance, which leads to the next urgent question. How is the United States preparing to defend the dollar? And what hidden weakness inside America makes it harder than ever to fight against a gold-backed challenger? How can the United States fight a gold-backed currency when its own financial foundation is built on something far weaker, debt? This is the truth Washington avoids in every press conference, every policy briefing, and every attempt to reassure the world. The dollar's strength no longer comes from gold, resources, or production. It comes from confidence. Confidence that America can manage its economy, pay its debts, and maintain global stability. But right now, that confidence is cracking. U.S. debt has exploded past levels once considered unthinkable. Interest payments are rising faster than America's budget for defense. Inflation has damaged trust in the dollar's stability. Political division makes long-term financial policy nearly impossible. And foreign nations, watching all of this unfold, are asking a dangerous question. If the dollar is no longer backed by gold, no longer trusted globally, and no longer stable internally, why should we depend on it? BRICS understands this weakness perfectly. That's why they chose gold, a symbol of permanence, to challenge a system built on borrowing. A gold-backed currency exposes the fragility of a debt-backed empire, and as America tries to counter BRICS, it faces a problem it cannot print its way out of. The world is diversifying away from U.S. bonds, reducing dollar reserves, and shifting toward hard assets. For young viewers, here is the core lesson. Currencies done fall when they re-attacked from the outside. They fall when their foundations weaken from within. And right now, the dollar faces both internal instability and external competition. A gold-backed BRICS currency doesn't just offer an alternative, it highlights a flaw America has ignored for decades. Which brings us to the next critical turning point. How will global markets react as BRICS strengthens its gold reserves? And what happens when investors, not governments, begin choosing gold-backed money over the dollar? What happens when global investors, not governments, begin choosing a gold-backed currency over the US dollar? You get a financial shift bigger than any political announcement because markets move faster, louder, and with far more force than diplomacy ever can. The moment BRICS revealed its new gold-backed currency, traders, hedge funds, and central banks around the world began reassessing their portfolios. They saw a system where money is anchored to something real instead of endless borrowing. They saw nations buying record amounts of gold. They saw oil-producing countries signaling support. And markets did what they always do, respond to strength. Gold demand surged to its highest point in modern history. Major funds rotated out of U.S. bonds and into commodity-backed assets. Central banks reduced their dollar exposure and bought physical gold at the fastest pace since the 1950s. These moves weren't emotional, they were logical. Markets follow stability, and in a world full of inflation, debt crises, sanctions, and geopolitical tension, a gold-backed currency looks like an island of certainty. For young viewers, this is the part that will shape your lifetime. Markets decide which currency becomes powerful, not politicians. When enough investors trust a new system more than the old one, the transition becomes unstoppable. The dollar doesn't collapse overnight. It loses influence trade by trade, loan by loan, reserve by reserve. And as BRICS strengthens its gold position, the psychological shift grows. People begin questioning whether the dollar is still the safest asset, or just the most familiar one. Once trust moves, money follows. And once money moves, history changes. Which leads us to the next phase of this story. What happens when the BRICS gold-backed system expands beyond currency? And how will this new financial ecosystem reshape global trade, power, and the world young people inherit? What happens when a gold-backed currency becomes more than just money and evolves into a full financial ecosystem? That's the question now shaking global institutions. Because BRICS isn't stopping at creating a currency. They're building an entirely new economic architecture that could reroute global trade for decades. Their gold-backed currency is only the foundation. On top of it, BRICS is developing a new payment network that bypasses SWIFT, a digital settlement layer that clears transactions instantly, commodity exchanges that price goods in non-dollar units, and investment banks designed to finance projects outside Western control. This ecosystem gives countries something they've never had before, a parallel financial world where the dollar is not required and the U.S. cannot intervene. Imagine Africa trading minerals with Asia without touching the dollar. Imagine the Middle East selling oil and gas through BRICS rails. Imagine South America financing infrastructure without borrowing from dollar-based lenders. For young people, here's the deeper reality. When you control currency, you control trade. But when you control an entire financial ecosystem, you control the future. That is what BRICS is aiming for. And nations are paying attention because this system offers them leverage, independence, and stability backed by gold rather than political promises. As more countries integrate into this ecosystem, pressure builds on global institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and even Western stock markets. Trade routes shift, investment patterns shift, economic alliances shift, and slowly the balance of power moves away from Washington toward a new global center of gravity. But this transformation leads to the next and most critical question. How will the United States respond once it realizes BRICS isn't just creating a currency, but a competing financial world? And is America prepared for the biggest monetary challenge it has faced since World War II? What does a superpower do when it realizes, for the first time in 80 years, that its currency is no longer unchallenged? Behind closed doors, the United States is scrambling, quietly, urgently, and with far more concern than public statements will ever reveal. Washington understands the threat perfectly. A gold-backed BRICS system doesn't just compete with the dollar, it exposes the weaknesses that America has ignored for decades. So the U.S. is now trying to defend the dollar on multiple fronts at once. The Federal Reserve is accelerating research on a digital dollar to keep pace with BRICS, blockchain settlement systems. The Treasury is pressuring allies to reaffirm commitment to dollar-based trade. Intelligence agencies are monitoring BRICS financial cooperation as if it were a military alliance, and Wall Street lobbyists are warning Congress that the dollar could lose its global privilege faster than anyone predicted. But here's the uncomfortable truth. America is fighting this currency war with tools designed for a world that no longer exists. Sanctions don't work against a system that bypasses SWIFT. Diplomacy doesn't stop nations that already shifted to gold. Printing more money only undermines faith in the dollar. And military alliances can't force countries to store their wealth in U.S. banks. For young viewers, the critical lesson is this. Currency dominance isn't T defended with weapons. It S defended with trust. And that trust has been eroding as America struggles with inflation, political division, rising debt, and declining global influence. Meanwhile, BRICS is offering nations exactly what they want: stability, sovereignty, and a financial system immune to U.S. pressure. Now the world is waiting for the final question to be answered. Will the U.S. reinvent its currency system fast enough to maintain leadership? And what happens to the global economy if BRICS reaches its final game-changing goal, a fully functional gold-backed reserve currency used across continents? What does a gold-backed BRICS currency really mean for your future, your savings, your job opportunities, and the world you'll grow old in? It means we are entering a new monetary era, one where the dollar is no longer the single center of gravity, where global trade is shaped by competition instead of control, and where nations finally have alternatives to a system dominated by U.S. debt and political influence. For 50 years, the world relied on the dollar because no other currency offered enough stability, trust, or scale. But BRICS has now introduced something entirely different: a currency backed by real value, supported by rising economies, and protected by a new financial network built outside Western influence. This changes everything. It means the dollar will face long-term pressure. It means global markets will become more volatile. It means countries will shift their reserves into gold and commodity-backed assets. It means debt-driven economies, especially the U.S., will face tougher choices, higher borrowing costs, and reduced global privilege. But for young people, this is not a story of collapse. It's a story of transition. When financial systems change, opportunity explodes. Regions that were once ignored become investment frontiers. New industries emerge around digital currency infrastructure. Commodity-rich nations gain leverage, and individuals who understand these shifts early will position themselves ahead of an economic transformation others won't recognize until it's too late. The key lesson is simple. Currency wars rewrite the future, and we are living through one right now. The rise of a gold-backed BRICS currency marks the beginning of a multipolar monetary world, one where power is shared, not concentrated. The question now is not whether the dollar will lose influence, but how fast. And the question for you is this: will you adapt to this new era and use it to your advantage, or wait until the consequences reach your doorstep?